call Dr Megan Woods.
Mr Speaker, it's also my pleasure to take a call in this debate and to endorse the additional funding that have been given to our offices of Parliament. I'd like to join with the previous speakers and acknowledge the very fine work and the very fine individuals that carry out these very important constitutional tasks within our Parliament. I'd also like to echo some of the words of the previous speakers around how some of the appropriations simply aren't enough. And I too am going to refer to the Office of the Ombudsman. And I want to specifically talk about the work that the Ombudsman has been doing in the case of Christchurch. Because the Office of the Ombudsman and in particular the Chief Ombudsman has been a very important voice in holding the government to account in how it is that the recovery of Christchurch is being managed. In just to give an indication of the kind of level of work that the Ombudsman has been doing in regard to, in particular, EQC and the payout that individuals are getting through the Earthquake Commission. In 2012, the Ombudsman received 785 complaints regarding the Earthquake Commission. And then the year before that, it received an additional 737. In all, by 2012, the EQC had received more than 6,500 Official Information Act requests. This is how desperate people in Canterbury were to receive information about how their claim was progressing through the Earthquake Commission. And when that didn't go well, the recourse that these people had was to go to the Ombudsman and say that they hadn't been well served. And as I mentioned, the Chief Ombudsman, Dame Beverly Wakeham, has been an incredibly important voice in joining with community leaders and joining with advocates in Christchurch and saying that we have to treat, and that the EQC has to treat its customers better. That in terms of the stress, the Human Rights Commissioner has addressed this, the stress that has been put on people in not knowing what is happening with the repair of their house, something pretty fundamental about where they live, that this has been a particularly difficult aspect of the rebuild. And it has been an incredibly important voice from Dame Beverly that has been voiced here, and I would like to acknowledge that. Just this year in February, when an independent report found major failings in the way that the Earthquake Commission handled its customers, Dame Beverly strongly advised the EQC to release that report publicly and expressed that she was very disappointed at the very low-key launch that was around that report and urged to do more. Because, of course, it was the Office of the Ombudsman that produced a very important piece of work along with the Privacy Commissioner back in November of 2013, which was information fault line assessing EQC information in Canterbury, and found that OIA requests and processes were overcomplicated and were risk adverse and were adding to the stress that was there. So as my previous members of my party and previous members of this House have urged, that we need to be adequately resourcing this officer of our Parliament. But Mr Speaker, I would also like to address another important role that is covered off in these reports on the offices of parliaments, and that's the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. The Commissioner has a very, very specific role within our Parliament, and that is to maintain and improve New Zealand's environment by influencing decision makers through well-reasoned and independent advice. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of Dr Jan Wright in her office and the high quality of work that is produced from that office, and the fact that we as parliamentarians all benefit from what is well-reasoned and independent advice. And I think that the mohia that Dr Wright is often labelled with in the media, that of the voice of reason, is something that many of us within this Parliament would concur with, and see that Dr Wright's contributions are of a high standard and beneficial to us. One of the things that is incredibly important is the resourcing. If we have a look at just this year, what it is that Dr. Wright and her team have managed to produce for the edification of not only the public but also us as parliamentarians, we can see an impressive list of reports. There's a report on drilling for oil and gas in New Zealand, the environment oversight and regulation that's required for that, mining on conservation estates, hydroelectricity on wild rivers, climate change and rising seas, a report on the longfin eel, of course the first commentary on the 2014 Air Domain report, and just today a report tabled on stewardship land. So we see a huge breadth and a huge complexity of areas that are covered by Dr. Wright and her team, and one that whose reports I'm sure that we as members of this Parliament will eagerly await the arrival of those reports in our offices and devour them when they do arrive. But Mr. Speaker, Dr. Wright not only produces report, but she often submits on legislation. And this is a very important submission when it arrives. It's always well reasoned and contains a great deal of sense. Dr. Wright also has moved to sometimes comment on various environmental reforms that are going through, and just only a month or so ago that Dr. Wright warned about said that the RMA was no place for us to be having balance between the environment and the economy, and warned us that the RMA, in fact, was the legislation that was our fundamental environmental protections in this country and that needed to be respected as thus. So we have very wise words. But of course, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in her office is about to receive a new statutory function under the Environmental Reporting Act, which is to be which is to be reported back to this House next week and undergo a further stage towards its passage. Under this bill, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment will have a very important statutory function in terms of commentary. We saw the first of these commentaries coming out even before the Act was enacted in the Air Domain report, but there will actually be a requirement for the Parliamentary Commissioner and her team to produce these commentaries on the domain reports as they are produced. And this increased function is obviously going to result in increased work for the office and for the Commissioner and her team. And this is something that there is some discussion in the report that we have before us today, Mr. Speaker, that talks about the Environmental Reporting Bill proposing to establish a new system, and that additional funding has been given. An increase was given to Dr. Wright and her team of $450,000 to initially set up what was required in order to fulfil these statutory functions. And this was given for the 14-15 financial year, and the following year an increase of $300,000. So $300,000 in the 16-17 years, and in subsequent years that funding would be reassessed as required. And Mr. Speaker, what we did here when Dr. Wright came to our Select Committee and we asked about this, that unless that further assessment and reassessment of the workload is required, Dr. Wright made it very clear that the drop in funding could put a pressure on the office that could possibly result in staff layoffs. Now, this very important constitutional function that the Parliamentary Commissioner fulfills in keeping us and the public more informed on very complex, often very complicated and very technical topics is something that we simply cannot afford to lose as a Parliament. It's incredibly important that we have this level of independent and technical input so that our decision making in important areas can be better. And I would not like to see the decisions that we make in this House suffer because we're not getting the same standard of technical and independent advice that we've grown accustomed to from the Parliamentary Commissioner. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to see the fact that this committee would look very closely at the requirements, the future requirements of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and her team. We've seen that these officers in Parliament are incredibly important for the proper functioning of our democracy. They're incredibly important for how we can do our jobs as parliamentarians, and that it is not good enough that we underfund these institutions and these officers. As my colleague Chris Hipkins said in his speech, this needs to be recognised by both sides of the House, because come 2017, members on the government benches will be on this side of the House, and they will appreciate the oversight that the Office of the Ombudsman and the oversight the Office of the Auditor General and the advice from the Parliamentary Commissioner in informing them as parliamentarians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to endorse that everything that's been said by